What you've just watched is a preview of a new series, The Radium Girls. Every week in November we'll be releasing an episode, each one taking you deeper into the story. Episode 1 will premiere in November. And if you're watching this now, thank you for being part of our journey. When we started working on this series, we knew we had to do it right, and with an incredible voice. You've heard her in some of our other productions. Now hear her bring the Radium Girls to life. You can also learn more about the real Radium Girls through additional resources, including a digital exhibit. You can access it all through the provided links. Thank you for joining us. Let the story begin. This series is more than a collaboration. It's a labor of love, a shared passion for uncovering history that's been overlooked. Radium is everywhere in the story, in the paint, in the bones, in the shadows cast by the past. You find a visual artist who can create something breathtaking. Meet Carolina. She worked closely with our team to develop the look of the series, combing through historical records to make sure every detail was perfect, down to the style of dress and the shape of the factories. So, we got experts to help us find and analyze primary sources, everything from medical journals to vintage advertisements. We wanted to see the world through the lens of science the same way the Radium Girls did. But telling this kind of story comes with a challenge. How do you make the unseen seen? And finally, how do you bring all of this to life? We hope you enjoy it, and if you do, please share it with friends and family. They glowed, the Radium Girls' faces painted on dials to light up the darkness, glowing in the black velvet night of history. They glowed, their bones green and ghostly, haunted by the very progress they'd helped create. The radium that made their bones glow was the same radium that was now killing them. It was in their blood. It was in their teeth. It was in their very marrow, turning the inside of their bodies into ticking tombs. And as they glowed, a chilling truth dawned on the world, lower jaws eroding until their chins collapsed into their throats. It was argued that women were sick from syphilis, from poor nutrition, from hysteria. They used delay tactics in court, hired powerful lawyers, shuffled blame between departments. It was unprecedented. Working-class women, sick and dying, taking on a major corporation backed by government contracts and public trust. And yet they won. Their story became a landmark in labor rights and workers' protections while their executives thrived in comfort. The girls coughed blood in tenement rooms, their lawsuits stalled by bureaucracy and greed. By 1928, their bodies were ticking down. And yet they had carved something permanent into history. Their glow, once sold as novelty, had become illumination of another kind. The truth behind industrial silence. The courtroom was not where justice was found, it was where the cost of silence was measured. Ankles twisting from mere steps, pelvises shattering under their own weight, they were collapsing inward, becoming fragile statues hollowed out by betrayal. But the biggest shock came when those tombs were disinterred years after their deaths. When their coffins were pried open, and the world saw what lay inside, those corpses didn't look like corpses, they looked like relics. They were radioactive. But she, along with other girls like her, Edna Huss, Catherine Shaw, Quinta MacDonald, Albina Larice, continued to testify from wheelchairs, from hospital beds, with crutches, splints, and fading breath. They described their jobs, the lip pointing, the pain, the denials, the knowledge that they had been used, fed to the altar of progress. Dr. Harrison Martland, the doctor who first identified radium poisoning, examined the bones of the deceased dial painters and found terrifyingly high concentrations of radioactivity. The dose, he realized, came simply from painting dials. And then he understood the horror. The radium had replaced the calcium in their bones, atom by atom, and now those atoms were decaying from within. It was like the Grim Reaper had gone to art school, learned to paint dials with glowing bones, then returned to collect his payment. The women, meanwhile, were crumbling from the inside out, bones breaking, joints fusing, then fracturing. And thus Radium, the company that employed them, still denied everything. They claimed the science wasn't settled. Grace Fryer, now the face of the battle, could no longer walk without assistance. Her spine had begun to compress from within. Finally, in 1928, the Radium Girls case reached national attention, but for most of the women, the victory was hollow. It is October 25, 1932. Eben Byers is dead. The press has a field day. The self-proclaimed lone wolf of Wall Street expires from radium-induced jaw rot and organ failure. Hundreds of people across the country have fallen victim to radium poisoning, lured in by false promises of health and beauty. And in the end, it took Eben Byers, one of the richest men in the country, to sound the alarm. Despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, corporate-sponsored scientists refuse to testify. But the public is growing weary. The glow, once celebrated, now sends shivers down their spines. Soil samples showed elevated radiation levels decades later. In some cases, entire lots were deemed uninhabitable. Ottawa, Illinois, faced similar challenges. The Radium Girls' light had reached further than anyone expected. Their story began appearing in labor law textbooks, in occupational health seminars, in feminist history courses. For once, the world didn't forget. Their names resurfaced not just in legal documents, but in plays, documentaries, and eventually books. Decades after their deaths, the first public memorials were created. In 1980, a plaque was unveiled in Ottawa, Illinois, honoring the women who had worked there. It was modest, easy to miss, but it marked a turning point, a formal acknowledgement of what had been denied for so long, that these women were not expendable, that they were not anonymous. They were pioneers, suffering once but pioneers nonetheless. Even in death they had kept illuminating the truth. And perhaps, in some cosmic irony, their glow had done what no warning label could. It had revealed the danger, made it impossible to ignore, turned the night sky of American progress just a little dimmer. Their bones still whisper. And finally the world began to listen. Construction projects disturbed contaminated soil, leading to renewed fears among residents. Children played on grounds that had once housed radium operations. Schools and homes were built where luminous paint had once spilled onto factory floors. He had consumed 1,400 bottles of Radither, a popular radium tonic. The slogan on the label, "A cure for the living dead." It's not an exaggeration, by the end of his life he was literally one. But Eben Byers was not the only one. In 1932 the FDA seized 3,000 bottles, and a year later the company that made it, the U.S. Radium Company, filed for bankruptcy. Radium behaves like a molecular saboteur. Once inside the body, it mimics calcium and infiltrates bones, emitting alpha particles for years, sometimes decades. It has a half-life of 1,600 years. In practical terms, it means that the women who ingested it will die with it still inside them, barely weakened. The legal battles were over. The science had spoken. But something lingered. Workers at the radium processing plant were dying of radium-induced cancers. The glow was literally killing people, but the industry fought back. Chemical companies spent millions on public relations campaigns. Scientists were paid to downplay the findings. Memos revealed a concerted effort to minimize panic, and they feared not just lawsuits but loss of control. The factories were gone, the billboards taken down, but the soil remained contaminated. The radium was not just in the ground, it was in the water, in the homes, in the schools. Residents were terrified to rebuild. Children could not play outside. Homes were abandoned. In some places the radiation was so bad that nothing could grow. Entire city blocks died. At the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, scientists uncovered the terrible truth. But the science does not stop at their graves. Soil samples show elevated radiation levels decades later. Years pass. The factories are gone. The U.S. radium facility in Orange was eventually demolished, but not before generations of workers and nearby residents were exposed to lingering contamination. But the story doesn't end there. The Radium Girls didn't set out to change the world. They just wanted to do their jobs and earn a living. They had no idea that their bones would end up rewriting history. The industrial boom had brought wealth, but also brutal exploitation. By the 1940s, protective gear, safety signage, and industrial hygiene departments began appearing in factories across the country. Health monitoring protocols were established. Scientific whistleblowers gained credibility. The workplace was no longer an invisible world, separate from legal scrutiny. It was a battleground of ethics and accountability. For women especially, the Radium Girls became symbols not just of suffering but of agency. They had spoken when told to be quiet, testified when their jaws were broken, fought back when they were expected to fade away. Their legacy was one of bodily autonomy, of the right to demand safety, truth, and respect, even from institutions built to deny them those things. Their names entered case law. Their stories entered labor history. Their pain carved a path for protections millions would later take for granted. And yet they remained largely unknown to the public. History remembered wars, presidents, and inventors, but glowing girls with crumbling bones. That story was too sad, too inconvenient. It flickered at the edge of remembrance like a dimming watch face in a dark drawer. If you were injured or poisoned on the job, the burden of proof fell on you, and few had the strength or knowledge to challenge corporate power. This is part 1 of a 2-part series. Don't forget to subscribe for part 2 coming soon. The Radium Girls exposed the flaw in that system. Their suffering was too public, too grotesque, too radioactive to ignore. Lawmakers began to take notice. The pressure led to improved workers' compensation laws, particularly in Illinois and New Jersey. New regulations were drafted to require companies to investigate and disclose known hazards. The idea that a corporation could be held responsible for long-term harm caused by slow exposure began to enter legal precedent, something that didn't exist before. It was a terrifying notion for industry. If companies could be sued for harm that manifested years later, then no business using dangerous materials was safe from future liability. And that meant money, lots of it. But instead of fighting new protections, many businesses quietly shifted tactics. They began investing in public relations, corporate image building, and behind-the-scenes lobbying. Still, the Radium Girls had changed the battlefield. Their cases were cited in future lawsuits against asbestos companies, chemical manufacturers, and eventually Big Tobacco. The very idea of class action suits for toxic exposure could trace a thread back to the quiet rooms where glowing bones were first examined by a skeptical doctor. This is the story of the forgotten women who glowed in the dark. Do you ever feel like your problems are being ignored? Like nobody cares about what you have to say? The Radium Girls felt that every day. They were young, working-class women, many with little education, no political voice, and few financial resources. Their stories began in quiet desperation, and ended with courtroom whispers where men in suits measured justice and costs and convenience. But despite the overwhelming imbalance, their cases changed everything. What began as a small series of wrongful death suits in the 1920s would ultimately ripple through the decades, reshaping labor law, corporate liability, and worker protection legislation across the United States and beyond. Before their fight, companies had little legal obligation to ensure the long-term safety of their workers. But there was another quieter effect too, one that reached into the lives of every worker. Now, stay tuned for part 2, where we'll uncover the truth behind the mysterious illness that haunted these women and the groundbreaking legal battles that followed. They're not here anymore, almost none of them. But what if they were? What if they were here right now, walking among us, talking, laughing? They were artists. Their medium was radium. Their canvas was anything that would hold still, including themselves. They painted their nails, their teeth, their faces. They wore it like perfume. They ate it with their lunches, unaware that they were swallowing their future. What if they took off their gloves and we saw their hands were luminous, not with jewelry or ink, but with radium? Their corpses, locked in a decaying embrace with an element that should never have touched them, are still active, still dangerous. They are not history. They are warning. They are light. And some lights never go out. And perhaps somewhere deep underground, if you listen close enough, you'll hear them, not screaming, not crying, but whispering, "We were here. We were bright. You knew." Would we notice? Would we care? Or would we keep on talking, keep on eating, keep on smiling, unaware that every breath we share might be our last? More than a century ago, hundreds of women sat at tables, dipping brushes into paint, painting dials, painting watches, painting the hands of clocks that tick to this day. Their story is almost forgotten. The companies that employed them no longer exist. The factories are gone, dismantled, cleared away. The ground packaged and sold as safe and clean. They tried to, but the poison was invisible and insidious, a seductive glow that seemed like magic, a miracle, the power to heal, to help, to give light in the darkness. How could they have known? Most didn't die right away. Some lived long enough to see their teeth rot. Some miscarried again and again, watching their hopes die. Others simply disappeared, lost in the paperwork of a bygone era, their names and faces fading with each passing decade. But what if the ground remembers? What if the soil in New Jersey and Illinois still holds their ghosts? What if they're here in the dirt, in the silence, in the spaces between the houses and the schools and the playgrounds? What if they're here in the cancer clusters and the birth defects, in the rashes and the fevers, in the unexplained illnesses that dog the residents of towns like Ottawa and Orange? What if we just can't hear them? What if we could dig them up, dust them off, and ask them why? Why did you let them do this to you? Why didn't you speak up? Why didn't you fight? The truth is they did fight. But what if they haven't faded? What if they're still here, watching, waiting, whispering to the trees and the birds, to the cars and the crowds? Scientists have estimated that the bones of the Radium Girls will remain radioactive for thousands of years, longer than any of us will live, longer than the countries that killed them. So when the dial glows in the dark, when the paint catches your eye, when progress promises wonders without cost, remember the girls who glowed and died for it.